Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the transformation of the Republican Party, not the transformation of the 1960s and Richard Nixon's so-called Southern strategy to appeal to white Southerners after the Democratic Party embraced civil rights. Instead, we're going to focus on the time of Reconstruction, the time after the Civil War in which the country experimented with a radical multiracial democracy before it was put down. It was a period of time that my guest argues the Republican Party that was born in the 1850s to take on the slave power of the South transformed itself into a big business pro-imperialist party. My guest for this is Manisha Sinha. Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She is a historian of the Civil War, and she is the author of the book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. Manisha Sinha, it's my good pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Again, just the subtitle of your book, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920, is interesting. We usually see Reconstruction as beginning right after the Civil War. We have the Civil War amendments. We have the first time that African Americans are elected to Congress and to state legislatures throughout the South. And then that sort of comes crashing down in the 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Tilden in an election that was controversial, and Democrats and Republicans strike a deal to end the military occupation of the South. Hence, Democrats let Republicans have the presidency. It's usually told that's when Reconstruction ends. But you have Reconstruction going for a good 60 years until the 1920s.
Yes, traditionally, as you said, Reconstruction is always seen as that sort of short period after the Civil War, kind of a blip in U.S. history. And I was really interested in looking also at the period after the fall of the Southern Reconstruction state governments, the last one of those in 1877. I wanted to go right up to the early 20th century to look at the ways in which Reconstruction was undone. So to really understand the significance of Reconstruction as this bold experiment in interracial democracy, we cannot just talk about its brief triumph, its brief contested triumph, I would say, because if you do that, then it, as I said, it appears as just a very short moment in U.S. history with no long-term ramifications. And I really wanted to trace how the forces of reaction, both North and South, undo the legacy of Reconstruction over a long period of time, with the establishment of Jim Crow, with the conquest of the West, with the takeoff of industrial capitalism in the North, and the rise of a formal overseas American empire after the Spanish-Cuban-American War of 1898. And I couldn't tell that whole story, that long unwinding of Reconstruction, when actually the legal disfranchisement of Black men was implemented, without looking at this period and without understanding the contestation that shaped both Reconstruction, the conventional view of Reconstruction as just that period after the war, and its long unwinding.
So just quickly, Reconstruction is something in recent years people have been talking a lot more about. For many years, Reconstruction was always seen and described as a failure. And more modern day, we talk about Reconstruction as something that was actually quite good and positive for a short period of time. You say, again, you look at it in a much longer period of time, but then came crashing down. Just so everyone is on the same page, though, can you just quickly tell me what's important to know about what Reconstruction was?
Yes. So, a lot of Americans don't know that immediately after the Civil War, in fact, starting right with the election of Lincoln, I argue, in 1860, the first American republic falls apart. And you have to reconstruct this republic, which is what I call the Second American Republic. And what's amazing about this period in this kind of reconstruction of the Union, getting those ex-Confederate states back into the Union, we literally reimagine American republicanism and American democracy. This is the time when you have three rapid amendments to the Constitution that not only abolished slavery, but established equality before the law for everyone, regardless of color and previous condition of servitude. The 14th Amendment, from which we derive many of our modern day rights, which are again under attack. And of course, the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. So Reconstruction unleashes the forces of progressive constitutionalism, and its ramifications, I argue, are felt right up to the 19th Amendment, when women get the right to vote, an amendment that is closely modeled after the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. So for the first time in American history, you have federal civil rights laws. You have the principle.
That's significant. Can I just, forgive me, but that's significant. That's the first time we have such laws in which rights are enshrined in the laws, other than, I guess, the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. And interestingly, the term Bill of Rights for the first 8 amendments to the U.S. Constitution was given by one of the authors of the 14th Amendment, who wanted to nationalize those rights for everyone, right?
John Bingham?
John Bingham, exactly. He comes up with the notion of Bill of Rights, and now we all call it the Bill of Rights. But this expansive egalitarian notion of rights for all American citizens, a national birthright citizenship that troubles a lot of people today, all those ideas come about during Reconstruction. Even federal civil rights laws that can be enforced, or what we would call today hate crime laws, the enforcement acts against domestic terrorism by groups like the first Ku Klux Klan in the South. The formation of the Department of Justice takes place during Reconstruction. The first income tax, the idea that the government is responsible for the welfare of its most vulnerable citizens, in this case, mainly former slaves, comes about from Reconstruction. So many of our ideas of modern democracy are born then. And you have this amazing experiment in interracial democracy that many historians of Reconstruction, starting with Du Bois, have documented. When you have significant Black political power, not to the extent that Southern white reactionaries and elites argue that somehow they were being put under the thumb of what they called, quote, Negro rule. But you did have a Republican Party in the South that was a coalition of former slaves, white Southern Republicans, and Northerners who had gone down South to take part in this experiment. So it is an unusual period in American history, with the federal government trying to guarantee the rights and welfare and well-being and establish the rule of law in the former Confederacy, taking a far more active role than it had done previously in terms of ensuring citizens' rights and defining it nationally. And those ideas are really important for us today. One of the Civil Rights Acts actually outlawed segregation. Charles Sumner's 1875 Civil Rights Act, before Jim Crow was even born. He was prescient enough to see that happening. And that is, of course, declared unconstitutional by an extremely reactionary Supreme Court, a conservative Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, that has not played a very admirable role in the history of American democracy, does not at this time either. They roll back many of these rights. And many of the rights that were conferred to freed people, as in the 14th Amendment, they argue that these are actually rights that are guaranteed to railroads and corporations, so completely misconstruing those acts. So I really do think that this is an important moment to look at, and this history is somewhat familiar now to many people who are not still caught up in lost cause mythologies of the Civil War and Reconstruction. But what is not very clear, I think, to a lot of people is the way in which all this is undone. It's not just like this one moment in 1877 when the last Reconstruction state governments fall. It takes a long time to undo all these gains, right up to the 1890s, with Southern state constitutions legally disfranchising Black men, or with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which kind of gives the green light to to Jim Crow in the South by the Supreme Court. And of course, also, you continue to have challenges to interracial governments, which are mainly coalitions between Black Republicans and populists, Southern white farmers who come together in state governments and local city governments across the upper South states, like in North Carolina. And you have the famous Wilmington massacre and coup, where a group of a racist white mob, literally violently overthrows an interracial city government.
This is in North Carolina?
This is in North Carolina, the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. And these stories never get told as part of the history of Reconstruction. And we really need to do that. And we also need to connect it with developments across the nation.
I suspect most people still don't know much about the Wilmington Massacre.
No, I mean, recently there was some attention paid to this because a local North Carolinian historian has done wonderful work on it. And there have been very recently, some new books just focusing on the Wilmington Massacre. But the notion that you could use political terror and violence to overthrow a legally elected government was something that we don't associate normally with the history of American republicanism. With the January 6th insurrections, people were shocked. They were like, where's this coming from? And you can give multiple examples from Reconstruction and its aftermath in which political violence is used to overturn elections, to completely stymie democratic governments in the South.
How did they overthrow it? Did they do it by guns? Through the election and coerce? How did that happen? How do you overthrow a local government?
Exactly. So you delegitimize the government by constant acts of political terror. What happens with many of these Southern Reconstruction governments is that once they are elected, the Reconstruction Acts had put the South under military rule in 5 districts. And once you had elected Republican governments in the South, Reconstruction governments, they were known as the radical governments, the federal government's responsibility was seen to be over. But in fact, many of these governments still depended on protection from the federal government because many former Confederates, in fact, became part of these domestic terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded right off the bat in 1866. But there were many others when that is put down, like the White League, the White Liners, the Red Shirts of South Carolina that continue to take part in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. Red shirts, a lot like the brown shirts or the black shirts of Mussolini.
I've never heard of the red shirts. I like to think I know a little bit about this history, but I've never heard of the red shirts.
Yeah, they call themselves the Red Shirts in South Carolina. They call themselves the White League in Louisiana. They call themselves the White Liners elsewhere. But these were armed domestic terror groups that attacked African Americans. They assassinated a congressman. I don't think many Americans know this. In Arkansas, these terror groups actually assassinated a white elected congressman. So their terror was widespread. And this all happens under Grant, and he does try to send in federal troops to restore the rule of law in the South. But the point remains that in his second term, with the Panic of 1873, he's very much on the defensive. For the first time since the Civil War, the Republicans lose the House of Representatives in 1874 to the Democrats. And for your listeners who are all confused, everything you know about the two parties today, you need to just flip it for the 19th century. The Republican Party is the party of black rights, of anti-slavery, the party of Lincoln, of big government, of racial progressivism, while the Democratic Party is the party of states' rights, anti-big government, full of, many of these unreconstructed racist Southern elites. They call themselves the conservatives in the South. They fight elections on the radical ticket versus the conservative ticket, but it's the radical Republicans versus these Bourbon Democrats. They call themselves Bourbons too, after the French monarchy. That's how reactionary you could be at that point. And so, I think it's important to revisit this contestation We don't, we think of Reconstruction and all these wonderful rights that are achieved, and then it is overthrown suddenly. But in order to get a complete picture of this, one has to realize how these gains of Reconstruction and these legal and constitutional gains were contested right off the bat, and they were contested violently. And so without the protection of federal troops in the South, many of these Reconstruction governments simply fell victim to terrorism, to domestic political terrorism. You see this in Mississippi. It was known as the Mississippi Plan of 1875, where they completely attack Republican Party gatherings. They attack African Americans. They threaten to assassinate the governor of the state. They're out of control. And it's true even in Louisiana, and then later on in South Carolina, you have the massive massacre, the Colfax massacre that takes place at this time by white terror groups. The people who are indicted in the Colfax massacre of 1873, their case goes right up to the Supreme Court, which amazingly in Cruikshank versus the United States rules in favor of the terrorists. And says this is a state matter, and we cannot hold them liable for violating the civil, political rights and the human rights, one would say, of freed people. So the terrorism and the legal revanchism of the Supreme Court goes hand in hand, and these people are literally given a blank check. Now, you would think once they come into power in the South during the Jim Crow era that they would then stop the violence. The idea was now they can simply control southern state governments by removing Black people completely from the electorate and removing all dissenters even, not just Black people. You could be a southern white worker in the Knights of Labor, or you could be a populist and you could be a target for many of these reactionary groups. But they're not satisfied. In fact, violence increases. In the Jim Crow era, lynchings increase, racial massacres increase, and then it becomes a national phenomenon by the early 20th century, where you have, what are known politely as race riots, but really massacres taking place in Springfield and elsewhere. The Red Scare of 1919 then spreads even to all dissidents and other workers. So the Southern way becomes kind of the national way to
so
control.
You see links to the communist witch hunts.
Exactly. The Red Scare is also a Black Scare. You have you have many of these racial massacres occurring alongside with massacres and the violation of the civil liberties of dissidents, of workers, of trade unionists, you name it. And I draw those links in my book, showing how many of sometimes the same actors, sometimes the same troops, federal troops that are now guarding, federal, are actually involved in the Emancipatory Project during Reconstruction. They are completely now involved in a very different political project, unlike some other historians who simply see that as an extension of Reconstruction national political power. I argue that they go from an emancipatory political project to a reactionary one, and those same troops are firing at striking workers. Those same troops are being used to conquer and dispossess.
The troops who fought the Civil War are now being employed.
Sometimes it's one or two of the generals are the same, like Sherman, who actually after the Civil War goes to England to learn tactics of colonial warfare from the British that they have employed in the British Empire to use against Native American nations. Yeah. But sometimes they're new people like General Leonard Wood or General Nelson Miles, all these men who have lead the U.S. Army in the subjugation of Native nations will soon be part of the Imperial Project. They become governors of, Puerto Rico or Philippines. They're involved in, quote, the pacification of the Philippines after the Spanish-American-Cuban War. So they're sometimes the same people. These generals are the same.
Here in California, an important figure we have is John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont freed enslaved people before Lincoln did. When he would overtake plantations, he would just declare that folks are free now. But on the other hand, John C. Fremont was also a general and part of the sort of the Indian Wars, or part of the United States expansion westward, who was responsible, I think you could argue, especially in California, as being an early player in a genocide that would happen to California Indians.
Absolutely. Fremont, as the leading the Department of Missouri, issued his own proclamation, emancipation, egged on mainly by these German radicals from the 1848 revolutions who surrounded him in Missouri and who were some of the staunchest Unionists there. Missouri was part of the Union, but there was like a mini civil war going on there between Confederate guerrillas. And Fremont is a complicated figure because you're right, he takes part in that Indian warfare, and California is a really good example of that because there have been some excellent books written on California, and you can see how I'm sorry about that, and you can see how those people who settled California, men like Fremont, settlers, irregular militias, and also the U.S. Army undertake a program, a genocidal warfare against Native Americans there. So yes, he is definitely part of that story of the West also in the 1850s. This kind of genocidal policy in California and Oregon, which is not often looked at, but in Oregon they were awful. In California, some of them were Democrats, some of them were Republicans. In Oregon, most of them were Democrats. So it was across party lines. But criticisms of Reconstruction really emanate a lot from California. California refused to ratify the 14th Amendment because they were scared that it would give citizenship rights, including voting rights, to Chinese Americans. And the opposition to Reconstruction in California begins with extremely racist Democrats, and the Republicans adopt that criticism in California. And the Republican Party itself, by the late 1870s, early 1880s, is very much fashioned after a group of what were known as liberal Republicans, who are not only against Reconstruction, but they're against any government interference in the economy. They are, classical liberals, laissez-faire liberals, not modern liberals as we understand them. They're against any regulation of the economy or any protections for labor. And all this comes together in the fall of Reconstruction. Genocidal warfare against natives in the West, this kind of anti-big government views that becomes very popular among industrial and capitalist elites and big corporations in the North. They can totally sympathize with the Southern argument, Southern elites argument that government should not interfere with, quote, race relations in the South, and that the Southern elites should be left to manage this on their own. That combined with nativism and awful anti-Chinese sentiment, it all comes together in the story of the unwinding of Reconstruction and in the unwinding of this sort of broader emancipatory democratic vision for the country.
In some ways, this reminds me of the more modern debate over immigration in certain ways, not in every way, but in the way that I'm thinking specifically. You're talking about the Republican Party is changing during this period of time. And obviously part of that change is this pressure that's being brought on from this radical opposite side of it. When we talk about immigration today, I know immigrant rights activists certainly feel this way, that today the Republican Party just goes so extreme that it recenters where the center is. It replaces, it brings to the center to the right. And now you even have Democrats going further to the right. You have Joe Biden sealing the border. So it sounds like part of this transformation that we are seeing is sort of a reaction to the extreme measures that would we say I don't know if we'd say Democratic Party, or at least sort of Southern forces?
Well, there is definitely a completely reactionary bloc in the South, from Abbott to DeSantis, who have, done things that are illegal and who've gotten away with it. And with the kind of Supreme Court that we have today, that has no respect for ethics or the Constitution or any principles at all, they will be getting away with it. Let's see how they rule in Trump's claim that he has the right to assassinate his political opponents. I think the Biden administration here has been caught between a rock and a hard place, because when you start sowing racial divisions and inciting them, as the Republican Party has done over the years, it's pretty much a playbook out of the handbook of conservative Democrats in the 19th century, where you appeal to the imagined fears of the white majority. It's a good tactic to completely deflect attention from the fact that, let's say, billionaires are getting enormous tax cuts, that economic inequalities are growing, that you could be nativist and indulge in the most kind of cruel violations of both immigration and international law. That is possible because the immigrants are seen as being non-white, and in Trump's words, coming from dash hole countries, that you can really glom on to this virtually fascist, neo-fascist appeal to blood and ethnicity that goes against everything that American republicanism stands for, and its idea of civic nationalism, as I said, regardless of color, previous condition of servitude, or where you come from, and what you look like, and what religion you practice. The moment they start tearing apart that fabric of civic nationalism that holds republics together, especially the American Republic, you get this kind of reactionary history. And again, it's nothing new. They did that in the 19th century, and for a long time, what is known as the nadir, you could say the United States was hardly a democracy, in terms of the ways that freed people were treated in the South. And elsewhere, when it acquires formal colonies, the Supreme Court rules that the protections of the Constitution does not extend to these people. In the insular case, it does not extend to the islands. These are really important ways in which I think you can really appeal to the worst instincts and not the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln put it, in American history. And I think the Biden administration, seeing that it has been losing traction on this, unable to get the Republicans to actually pass the agreed upon immigration reform bill, decided that they have to somehow appease them. And I think, there are problems with that. It's a short-term, expedient political calculation before we can get comprehensive immigration reform in this country, which Republicans in the House have been blocking. And even when they've gotten terms that are quite conservative and favorable to them. You can see this in many of the policies of the Biden administration, where they feel that they have to constantly and this is the problem with the Democrats. We are always on the defensive. We are constantly looking at what the Republicans are saying and doing and reacting. And maybe it's about time that we were proactive, especially with the Supreme Court. I mean, you think of FDR, Biden likes to model himself after FDR. And indeed, his infrastructure bill, his pro-union stance is actually amazing since the days of FDR and LBJ, that we have like a forthright commitment to these ideals and ideas like workers' rights and growing the economy by government investment in it and uplifting even the poorest, trying to fight for a greater minimum wage, etc. So on those issues, I think the Biden and the Democrats are just far superior to the Republicans. The problem with issues of race is that it's very easy to race bait in this country. Lincoln faced it in the 1864 elections after the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, he thought he was going to lose that election because the Democrats race baited the quote, Black Republicans so much. They did it in opposition to Reconstruction and eventually broke that coalition between Southern white Unionists and African American Republicans. And they did it to put down, the labor movement, but also the populist revolt, and to sort of incorporate it and assimilate it within Democratic Party politics. So this is an old tactic. that I think reactionaries have used. They sort of honed it to perfection in the South with the overthrow of Reconstruction, and we are seeing a bit of it again today.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Manisha Sinha. Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and author of the book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. The title of your book, the Second American Republic, there are shades of the French Revolution and the republics that would come after that with the rewriting of constitutions, and I think that was purposeful. I do want to ask about the idea of a republic and the name of the Republican Party. Is when the Republican Party is formed in the middle of the 1850s, again, it's formed to take on the slave power of the South. Is do they decide, is the use of the term Republican as Republican Party, is that intentional?
The Republican Party in the 1850s is trying to show that even though they're an anti-slavery party and they want to prevent the expansion of slavery, that in fact they're truer to the foundations of the American Republic. Lincoln is constantly quoting the Declaration of Independence as our ancient faith. He's like, this is what we said, all men are created equal. And now suddenly we're saying not black people and not Catholics and not foreigners and he says, when we come to that, it's better to go to a pure autocracy like Russia, where they don't suffer from, in his words, the base alloy of hypocrisy. So the term Republican is purposely used by this new anti-slavery political party, which is a pretty revolutionary idea, that you would finally contain the rule of the slaveholders that had had a stranglehold on the federal government and American politics through the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. And it was evoking the Jeffersonian republics from the first party system of Federalists versus Republicans. But they wanted to show the country that our cause, our platform of anti-slavery is in sync with the founding ideals of the American Republic. The modern day Republican Party, and at least some people who claim to speak for it, conservative thinkers, will keep saying, we are not a democracy, we are a republic. We are a republic, but we are a democratic republic based on representative government and democratic governance. And since the Constitution was adopted, our democracy has only grown, right? We have severe setbacks, but it has grown in the sense that we have become a country of democratic republicanism, which they conveniently forget. During that time, you had property holding qualifications for voting. A lot of really right-wing Republicans would like that to happen again. We had women with no bodily autonomy, with no rights at all. And certainly you have justices in the Supreme Court like Samuel Alito who would want us to go back to the Middle Ages when it comes to women's rights. So the Republican Party today misuses this. I think, in fact, if you look at who have been traitors to the American Republic, you could point to the Southern secessionists, slaveholding secessionists, who broke up the First Republic, and today to those who would not adhere to our norms of governance and to our electoral norms, that you could pretend to be a patriot while violating every precept of American republicanism, representative government, actually quite astounds me.
I want to get back into this transformation of the Republican Party during the time of Reconstruction, second half of the 19th century. And again, you touched on this earlier, but I want to get a little more into it about imperialism. A move towards imperialism by the Republican Party. And when we say imperialism, we mean both the Indian Wars, right? These are imperial wars to take land going westward. You have the Mexican-American War, which is before the Civil War. So to put that out there, but these are states that are going to be, or that are just recently been brought in. And I'm getting that all mixed up there. Forgive me for that. I did some things before the Civil War, but the point is you still do have these Indian War. Wounded Knee happens in the 1890s. The massacre of Wounded Knee, and then all the way leading up to so that we should see those as imperialist wars. I think is the point I'm trying to say is the wars against Native Americans, and then you have the Spanish-American War of 1898. This is oftentimes described as the moment the United States now becomes an overseas imperialist power. Before it was just here on continental America. Now it's overseas. Tell me more about the Republican move towards imperialism. And I suppose is this not at the beginning of the party when it's founded in 1856?
Yeah, so there were certain people like William Seward, who was an anti-slavery Republican, who right from the beginning visualized a trading empire for the United States in the Pacific. He was very eager to get all these islands because he thought, the United States' economic might could grow. And during Reconstruction, and in fact, even during the Civil War, he becomes quite conservative in his reaction to secession till Lincoln overrules him. Lincoln the moderate overrules him, and Seward was considered the radical, a lot like Clinton and Obama, I feel sometimes, but Hillary Clinton and Obama in the primaries of 2008. But you can really see how the Republican Party, when it is formed against the predominantly democratic notion of expansionism, of continental expansionism. It's not as if they don't covet these lands, they do, but a lot of the Republican politics is honed in opposition to American expansionism. So Lincoln, for instance, like many Whigs, which was the party that preceded the Republican Party, opposes the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery. Many opposed the annexation of Texas in 1845, which is a democratic project and really supported mainly by Southerners. So you can see even in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that Lincoln is very wary of this notion of pro-slavery expansionism. And so on this issue, the Republican Party as a whole, they don't take a principled stance as such, but you can see throughout the fight over pro-slavery imperialism, filibustering movements to Cuba, to Nicaragua, trying to get Central America, this was really slaveholders' imperialism, and many Republicans were opposed to that. So there was a bit of a course correction during the Civil War when the Republican Party under Lincoln supports anti-slavery republicanism, like Benito Juarez and his fight against the French puppet ruler in Mexico. Many Southerners are very much interested in that monarchy that has been established by the French in Mexico. It's true also later on in the way Lincoln reacts to Latin American republics. It's not a program of imperialism so much as the idea that anti-slavery republicanism, which the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln personified, would spread. This starts changing, I think, with Seward, who acquires Alaska, for instance. He's a Johnson acolyte. He supports Johnson in his opposition to Reconstruction. Seward is an interesting character who really turns about face and he becomes far more of an imperialist as a Secretary of State. Not only does he acquire Alaska, he tries to acquire some other islands at this time. And then Grant also falls prey to this, especially, when he starts appointing a lot of these people to his cabinet. Conservatives, reactionaries, conservative Republicans, like Hamilton Fish or even Carl Schurz, who, initially, that was Rutherford B. Hayes would appoint Carl Schurz. And Carl Schurz actually opposed the acquisition of the Dominican Republic, which Grant wanted. Now, Charles Sumner, who was the voice of the anti-slavery conscience of the Republican Party, virtually single-handedly prevented the Grant administration from doing that. But there were many abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, who went along with this
Frederick Douglass, the great Frederick Douglass.
The great Frederick Douglass went along with this program. There were other black radicals later on, like T. Thomas Fortune, and of course, much later, Booker T. Washington, who supported European imperialist projects at times, by providing, expertise, or by simply thinking that Western civilization is needed for the rest of the world.
I mean, Frederick Douglass, wasn't he, I don't know, not technically maybe an ambassador, but sort of served in that role?
He was sent to Haiti, but in the Dominican Republic, he was part of the commission sent by Grant. And even though he's somewhat ill-treated by the administration, and he's trying, you can see how much he's torn in trying to protect the interests of the Dominican people against designs of American imperialism. He's still part of that project. But the old-time abolitionists like Sumner, like William Lloyd Garrison, are scathing critics of these plans. They are scathing critics of the Indian Wars. There are some historians who argue that the Indian Wars of the West is a continuation of the Civil War, and I don't agree with that. I think it's a colonial project, as you put it. These people are not following Lincoln's Code of War, the kind of warfare that they have, both in terms of dispossession of land, forcible assimilation, massacres of women and children, where rules of warfare are not followed, and there's kind of a brutal no-bar hold kind of warfare that takes place, is very reminiscent of colonial wars fought by European powers in Asia and Africa. And that's why I see the Indian Wars as colonial wars, and in fact as a stepping stone for American empire in the Pacific.
What's happening? Are there radical Republicans even though I suspect many of them are dying off during this period of time? But are there people that we consider to have been radical Republicans who are sort of not on board with this shift in the Republican Party towards imperialism and basically find themselves having no political home?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. You had people like Sumner, of course. He dies in 75, and Thaddeus Stevens dies much earlier. But Garrison, for instance, also dies around 1879. And all those ones who are still alive, Wendell Phillips, Garrison, they're big critics of the Republican Party and its new imperialist policy. And interestingly, those Dunning School historians, who had been bred, William Dunning, on the feet of the Southern political scientist at Columbia, John W. Burgess, he actually writes these first revisionist histories of Reconstruction, and he commends the Republican Party for not having in its mind all these false ideas of Black rights, but taking on the white man's burden. Now, they're very explicit about that. They constantly say these things. In fact, I find that many of the old radicals, if they're not dead and gone, continue to fight, or their children do. One of them, George Boutwell, who had taken part in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868, he was one of the House managers, is one of the founders of the Anti-Imperialist League, along with other luminaries like Mark Twain. Now, there were some Southern racist whites like Tillman, who was against acquisition of territory because he was nervous that we would get Black and brown citizens in the United States. He didn't want that. It had to be a white man's republic, similar to John C. Calhoun's critique of the Mexican War and the acquisition of Mexico. He's like, oh my God, we'll have all these Mexicans and they'll be citizens, and we can't have that. So there was some racist reactionary opposition, but really the mainstream Anti-Imperialist League was more progressives, socialists, pacifists, descendants of abolitionists. Many of them were involved in anti-imperialism, but also with the foundation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People after the Springfield riots in Illinois. So you can in fact draw a connection in that tradition. Sometimes it's the same people, sometimes it's the children of those people. Like Garrison's son is a leading pacifist and an anti-imperialist, and his grandson is in the NAACP. So, sometimes you do have those direct lineages and linkages, like the red diaper babies in the 60s. But many times it's that tradition, it's that broad tradition. And it's not as if even at the triumph of Jim Crow and, rapacious capitalism of the Gilded Age, etc., that those traditions died out completely, that contestation continued.
Can you tell me more about the Anti-Imperialist League? What was it?
They're very interesting. They were founded in Boston. I read some of their pamphlets that came out. They are very much connected with, Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. They support her petition against annexation of Hawaii, and they are very much in support of Aguinaldo's attempt to establish a separate Philippines Republic and not get annexed into the United States. They compare his conventions to the constitutional conventions of the United States, and their argument is that a republic cannot have colonies. We are not an empire. We fought against an empire. We are not an empire. So their arguments are kind of interesting. They also see it as a betrayal of the Republican Party's anti-slavery heritage and its commitment to citizenship regardless of color. And in fact, they're proven right, because in the insular cases, as I mentioned to you, the Supreme Court clearly says that the protections of the 14th Amendment do not extend to the inhabitants of American colonies and territories.
It is a period of time where
Guantanamo Bay in Cuba for that reason.
Which is interesting, because it's also this period of time, around this period of time, at least the period that you write about, in which the 14th Amendment, was basically became defanged, I suppose, when it came to protecting African Americans in this country and other minorities in this country, where it then actually went on to defend and support corporations. In other words, this is when corporations became people.
Yeah, I mean, that legal doctrine was there right from the start, but the extent to which it develops in the Gilded Age is exactly what you're saying. You can draw a straight line with that to corporations become people, or Citizens United that says unlimited cash donations count as free speech. All these perversions of rights that are supposed to be extended to human beings and not to business corporations are something that the Supreme Court has done, and it also illustrates one of the major themes in my book, which is in fact the conflict between democracy and rapacious, unregulated capitalism. Remember that it is under the Lincoln administration that for the first time we have a national income tax that is instituted, that a lot of Southern elites in opposition to the Reconstruction state governments that increased taxes on the rich in order to increase social services, in terms of asylums, orphanages, hospitals, schools. The South for the first time gets a public school system. They didn't have one like the North until Reconstruction. They have these, what they call taxpayers conventions, where they oppose the entire project of Reconstruction, both on political and ideological grounds, but racist grounds too, that we will not be paying taxes. And doesn't that sound familiar? No taxes, and all that is now part, ironically, of the Republican Party's agenda. These issues and our traditions of political conservatism, but also of the modern liberal social state, those ideas are really born during Reconstruction, and those contestations actually continue in our time. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if you read the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if you read them, they're saying they're implementing the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Yeah. No, so the whole civil rights movement was about getting the 14th, 15th, really the exactly. 14th Amendment and 15th.
To simply implement it. And in our modern times, that brief respite that we've had from reactionary decisions of the Supreme Court, the Warren Court, when for the first time those acts and amendments were interpreted correctly. And now again, with Shelby versus Holder, we have a way to emasculate the Voting Rights Act. So every time we think we have won those victories, political reaction surfaces its head, whether the grassroots in anti-tax slogans, anti-big government slogans, but also at the legal level in the Supreme Court, to completely, emasculate those mainstays, I would say, of American democracy.
Manisha Sinha has been our guest. Again, Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and she is the author of the book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920. Manisha Sinha, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.